I always believed a house could wait for its owner, but I learned the hard way that some people mistake silence for surrender. The first thing I noticed wasn't the empty lot. It was the smell. Fresh diesel hung in the warm afternoon air, mixed with splintered pine and damp concrete dust that settled across my boots like gray snow. Then I heard the slow metallic click of a bulldozer cooling down somewhere behind the piles of broken lumber. My suitcase slipped from my hand without me realizing it. I blinked once, twice, trying to convince myself I had turned onto the wrong street after spending 3 weeks inspecting a bridge project nearly 2,000 miles away. But the old oak tree at the edge of the property was still there, its branches stretching over the driveway exactly the way my father used to trim them every spring. The cracked stone mailbox still leaned 2 inches to the left because he always said fixing it would erase its character. Everything around it was familiar except the one thing that mattered. My house was gone. Nothing remained except scattered bricks, twisted copper pipe, shattered windows, and a bright green construction sign planted right in the center of my family's property. Future Community Park. Approved by Willow Creek Estates HOA. Estimated completion, 30 days. I stood there long enough for the breeze to carry another wave of dust across my face before a worker in a reflective vest climbed down from a loader and slowly removed his hard hat. He looked from the sign to me, then back toward the empty foundation. "Sir," he asked quietly, "wasn't this your house?" I nodded because my throat had forgotten how to work. Across the street, curtains moved. Garage doors cracked open just enough for neighbors to peek outside. Some recognized me immediately. Their expressions weren't surprised. They looked relieved, almost like they'd been waiting for someone to finally come home. A little girl riding her bicycle stopped at the sidewalk and stared at the empty lot before her mother gently turned the bike around, without saying a word. The silence was heavier than any argument could have been. I walked forward carefully, every step crunching. Over pieces of broken roof shingles that had once covered the bedroom where my parents slept for nearly 40 years. My hand brushed against a scorched cedar board that still carried traces of blue paint from the porch swing my mother insisted on repainting every Memorial Day. I could almost smell her coffee drifting through the kitchen window, almost hear my father laughing because I tracked mud across his clean floor after mowing the lawn. Those memories didn't disappear with the walls. They were suddenly standing beside me, making the empty space feel impossibly crowded. I reached the cracked concrete slab where the front door used to stand and noticed something lying beneath a layer of dust. A brass house number. 17. Bent, scratched, but still readable. I picked it up, closed my hand around it, and looked toward the polished HOA sign waving proudly in the breeze. They believed they had erased my home while I was away. What they didn't know was that they had just created the most expensive mistake their homeowners association would ever make. My name is Ethan Carter, and until that afternoon, I thought success meant designing structures that would outlive me. For 15 years, I had traveled across the country inspecting bridges, restoring historic buildings, and helping small towns reinforce aging infrastructure before storms could tear them apart. Ironically, I had spent my entire career protecting other people's property while believing the one place I loved most would always be waiting for me back home. That little white house was never about square footage or market value. It sat on just under 2 acres outside the city limits, surrounded by maple trees my grandfather planted after returning from the Korean War. Every autumn the leaves painted the yard bright orange and deep crimson, and my mother always joked that nature worked harder than any landscaping company the neighborhood could ever hire. The porch swing had been built by my father with nothing more than cedar planks, patience, and an old toolbox that still smelled faintly of machine oil. Every scratch on the hardwood floor carried a story. Every doorway had a pencil mark showing how much I had grown each birthday until I left for college. Even after my parents passed away within 3 years of each other, I never considered selling the property. People asked me why I kept driving back every weekend instead of buying something newer closer to downtown. They never understood that some places stop being real estate and become family. Before leaving for my latest assignment in Montana, I prepared the house the same way I always did. The lawn was trimmed to exactly 3 inches. The flower beds were freshly mulched. I programmed the lights inside to switch on every evening. My neighbor, Harold Simmons, collected my mail twice a week and parked his pickup in the driveway every Sunday morning just to make the place look occupied. I paid every property tax before it was due. Every insurance premium cleared automatically. Every utility account remained active. There was nothing abandoned about that house except the ridiculous story someone had apparently invented while I was gone. I had only lived under the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association for 4 years, mostly because the boundary line shifted after a nearby development expanded. I attended exactly 2 meetings. During both of them, I kept hearing the same polished speeches about improving community standards, increasing property values, and creating a modern neighborhood identity. The words sounded pleasant enough until I noticed they were always followed by another proposal to remove something old in order to build something new. My house became an easy target because it did not match the oversized brick homes that had appeared around it during the last decade. It was modest, traditional, and impossible to duplicate. Looking back, I remembered one conversation that suddenly felt different. Deborah Whitmore, the president of the association, had smiled while studying my front yard and casually said, "That corner would make a beautiful gathering space one day." At the time, I thought she was complimenting the landscaping. Standing in the middle of the empty foundation with my father's brass house number still resting in my hand, I finally understood she had never been admiring my home. She had been imagining the neighborhood after it was gone. Deborah Whitmore never raised her voice because she never believed she had to. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years convincing people that her opinions were the same thing as the law. The first time I met her, she stepped out of a spotless white luxury sport utility vehicle wearing a perfectly pressed cream-colored blazer that somehow looked untouched despite the Texas heat. She smiled warmly, shook my hand, welcomed me to the neighborhood, and within 30 seconds informed me that my mailbox color was not listed in the approved community design guide. That was Deborah in a single conversation. Every compliment came with a correction. Every greeting carried a warning hidden inside it. People spoke about her the way small towns talk about approaching thunderstorms. Nobody seemed surprised when she appeared. They simply adjusted their plans and hoped the damage would be minimal. She had been president of the Homeowners Association for almost 8 years, winning every election without serious opposition because most residents preferred paying fines over attending monthly meetings that stretched late into the evening. Her favorite phrase was community standards. She repeated those 2 words so often that they almost sounded comforting until you realized they justified everything she wanted. An elderly couple repainted their front door navy blue instead of approved colonial blue. Community standards. A retired teacher parked a fishing boat beside his garage for 2 weekends before taking it to the lake. Community standards. A family planted native wildflowers instead of imported decorative shrubs. Community standards. Somehow, every disagreement ended exactly where Deborah wanted it to end. The association board rarely questioned her decisions. They simply nodded while she organized neat folders across polished conference tables and explained how every new restriction would increase property values. Looking back, I realized my house had fascinated her from the beginning because it refused to fit into the image she was trying to create. It was built long before the surrounding development existed. It had character instead of symmetry, history instead of trends, and mature trees that could never be replaced by decorative saplings. During one neighborhood picnic, I overheard her giving a walking tour to prospective buyers. She pointed toward my property without realizing I was only a few yards away. "Imagine how open this entrance could become with a proper community feature," she said while gesturing toward my front yard. The buyers smiled politely, assuming she was describing land the association actually owned. Deborah never corrected them. Instead, she continued discussing future improvements as though my home were already part of her blueprint. Harold later admitted that after I left for Montana, expensive survey crews began visiting the neighborhood almost every week. They measured sidewalks, placed bright orange stakes near my property line, and spent hours studying maps from the back of pickup trucks. Whenever curious neighbors asked questions, Deborah answered with the same polished smile. Just planning for the future. Nobody imagined the future she had already decided upon. Standing there with the afternoon sun reflecting off the green sign planted where my living room once stood, I realized something that made the silence around me feel even colder. Deborah had never acted on impulse. Every smile, every meeting, every harmless conversation had been another careful step toward convincing an entire neighborhood that my home was simply an obstacle waiting to disappear. Harold was the first neighbor willing to tell me what had happened, but even he kept looking over his shoulder as though someone might be listening. He invited me onto his porch, handed me a glass of iced tea that neither of us touched, and slowly unfolded the timeline one piece at a time. It had started less than a week after my flight to Montana. A certified letter arrived at my empty house, claiming the association had concerns about an allegedly abandoned structure. 3 days later, another notice appeared, this one saying repeated attempts to contact the homeowner had failed. Harold remembered calling my cell phone, but I was standing beneath a steel bridge where there was almost no signal, and by the time I listened to his voicemail, he had already solved what he thought was a minor misunderstanding by collecting my mail as usual. Then temporary fencing appeared around my property without warning. Deborah assured every curious resident that the county had approved an improvement project benefiting the entire neighborhood. She spoke with such confidence that most people assumed every legal requirement had already been satisfied. Survey flags multiplied across the yard, utility trucks marked underground lines with bright paint, and a contracting company delivered heavy equipment before sunrise 2 mornings later. Several neighbors questioned whether someone should wait until I returned, but Deborah reportedly smiled and replied that the owner had been notified repeatedly and that all necessary documentation had been completed according to procedure. Nobody wanted to argue with a woman carrying thick folders filled with official-looking papers. Harold admitted that he almost walked across the street to stop the work, yet he hesitated because he believed the county must have reviewed everything first. The machines rolled onto my driveway shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning. Workers removed light fixtures, stacked reusable bricks onto pallets, and loaded sections of lumber into waiting trucks. They were not acting recklessly. They genuinely believed they had been hired for an authorized project. One contractor even knocked on Harold's door to apologize in advance for the temporary noise, explaining that the association planned to create a welcoming green entrance for the subdivision. By late afternoon, the roof had disappeared from the skyline that had looked exactly the same for decades. The next morning, concrete trucks arrived to break apart the remaining foundation, and landscape crews measured spaces for walking paths and decorative benches. Before the week ended, fresh topsoil covered most of the evidence that a family home had ever stood there. Finally, the polished green sign appeared, announcing the future park as though it had always been part of the neighborhood's master plan. Harold lowered his eyes before quietly admitting something that stayed with me. He said the hardest moment was not watching the equipment arrive. It was seeing several children ride past on their bicycles that evening asking where the old White House had gone, while their parents simply told them it was time for something newer. I looked back toward the empty lot through Harold's front window and realized how completely the story had already been rewritten. My home had not just been removed from the landscape. Someone had tried to erase it from the neighborhood's memory before I even knew anything had happened. The next morning, I started doing what I had always done whenever something did not make sense. I stopped guessing and started collecting facts. My first visit was to the county sheriff's office because I honestly believed there had been some incredible misunderstanding. The deputy behind the front desk listened patiently while I explained that I had returned from a work assignment to find my home demolished. He typed my address into his computer, frowned for a moment, and then quietly told me that the record showed a permitted demolition connected to a civil property matter. He apologized, but there was nothing his department could investigate unless there was evidence that a crime had occurred. It was the first door that closed in front of me. My next stop was the county building department. I expected someone to look at the photographs on my phone, shake their head, and immediately recognize that a terrible mistake had been made. Instead, an employee disappeared into a back office for nearly 20 minutes before returning with a thin folder. She explained that according to the paperwork available in their system, requests had been submitted, inspections had been completed, and the project had been marked as finished. She could not explain why I had never signed anything, but she also could not simply erase documents that already existed in the official record. She suggested that I speak with an attorney. That sentence followed me through the rest of the week. The first lawyer I met skimmed through my photographs, listened to my story, and admitted that homeowners associations often had complicated legal authority. He believed the case would require months of expensive litigation with no guarantee of success. The second attorney was more direct. He said that if the association possessed county-approved paperwork, a courtroom might assume they had acted within their authority unless overwhelming evidence proved otherwise. By the time I walked back to my truck that afternoon, I felt something I had not experienced in years. Helplessness. Every office I entered pointed me toward another office. Every conversation ended with another phone number, another appointment, another stack of forms. Meanwhile, the green sign remained planted where my living room used to stand, as though it had already won the argument. Deborah seemed determined to reinforce that feeling. Before sunset, I received an electronic notice from the Homeowners Association informing me that the lot would soon undergo landscaping improvements and that unauthorized entry into the construction area was discouraged for safety reasons. Reading those words while standing on land my family had owned for decades felt almost unreal. Somehow, I had become the outsider on my own property. Even Harold admitted that several neighbors had started assuming the association must have been right because official-looking documents appeared to support everything that had happened. Reputation has a strange way of following paperwork, even when the paperwork tells the wrong story. As I drove away that evening, exhausted and running out of answers, I caught myself looking at the bent brass number 17 resting on the passenger seat. It was the only piece of my home I still possessed, and for the first time since returning, I wondered whether someone had counted on me giving up before I ever discovered what had really happened. 3 days later, I stopped looking for people willing to agree with me and started looking for documents that could not. As an engineer, I trusted paper trails more than opinions because concrete does not care who tells the better story. Structures either meet the specifications or they do not. I walked into the county records office carrying nothing, except my driver's license, my property deed, and a notebook that had traveled with me to construction sites all over the country. An older clerk listened quietly while I explained that I wanted every public record connected to my address for the past 10 years. She disappeared into the archive room and returned pushing a cart stacked with folders, maps, permits, tax records, easement drawings, and scanned correspondence. Most people would have searched for one missing signature and gone home. Instead, I spent nearly 6 hours reading every page. Near closing time, I noticed something that almost everyone else had overlooked because it seemed too ordinary to matter. A survey map recorded more than 20 years earlier showed a narrow utility easement running along the edge of my property. That alone was not unusual. What caught my attention was a handwritten reference directing readers to a preservation filing stored under a completely different archive number. The clerk helped me retrieve that separate file, and inside was a designation protecting the original residence because it had been identified as one of the earliest surviving homes in the area during a county historical inventory. The designation did not prevent all future changes, but it required additional reviews before any demolition could legally proceed. I immediately requested the demolition packet that had supposedly authorized the work. The approval forms referenced routine inspections, yet there was no evidence that the required preservation review had ever been completed. The more pages I compared, the stranger everything became. Dates appeared out of sequence. Supporting documents listed attachments that were missing. One approval referenced a notification letter sent during the very week I was standing on a bridge project in Montana, but my travel records, hotel receipts, and airline itinerary proved I could not possibly have attended the meeting the paperwork suggested I had ignored. Then I reached the final authorization page. My name appeared beside a signature acknowledging notice. I stared at it for several seconds before sliding my own driver's license across the table. The handwriting did not even resemble mine. The clerk could not comment on its authenticity, but she quietly admitted that the signature in front of us looked noticeably different from the verified examples contained in older county records. For the first time since returning home, the weight pressing on my shoulders began to shift. Until that moment, I had been trying to prove that I had been treated unfairly. Now I realized something far more important. If the documents were inaccurate, the entire chain of approvals resting on those documents could also collapse. I carefully requested certified copies of every relevant record, placed them into a new binder, and walked out of the building holding something much more valuable than hope. I was carrying the first piece of evidence that suggested my house had not disappeared because of an unfortunate mistake. It had disappeared because someone expected nobody to compare one forgotten file with another. I knew better than to rush into a courtroom the moment I found those records. Evidence becomes powerful only after every loose end has been tied together. Instead of announcing what I had discovered, I quietly built a timeline that could survive every question a judge or attorney might ask. I hired a property rights lawyer named Rebecca Lawson, whose office walls were covered with framed survey maps instead of dramatic courtroom photographs. She spent nearly an hour reading through my binder without interrupting. When she finally looked up, she did not promise an easy victory. She simply smiled and said, "If these records are accurate, someone relied on people never comparing one file to another." That single sentence told me I had finally found the right person. Rebecca immediately assembled a small team that approached the case the same way engineers investigate a structural failure. Every claim had to be supported by measurable facts. A licensed document examiner compared the signature on the county notice with years of verified signatures from mortgage records, tax filings, and engineering licenses. The differences were obvious enough that even I could recognize them. A professional land surveyor overlaid historical property maps with the association's recent development drawings and discovered that several planning sketches treated my privately owned parcel as though it were already common community space months before the demolition ever occurred. Meanwhile, I requested satellite imagery and legally available aerial photographs taken during the weeks I was working in Montana. The images showed temporary fencing appearing around my property days before the official demolition approval listed in the county file. The sequence did not match the paperwork. Rebecca instructed me not to contact Deborah, not to confront the Homeowners Association, and not to post anything online. She wanted every official statement they made to remain unchanged. Weeks passed while the association proudly continued discussing the future park in newsletters and meeting minutes. Every new announcement became another timestamp in our growing file. Deborah even approved promotional illustrations showing benches, decorative lighting, and walking paths exactly where my front porch had once stood. Those glossy renderings unknowingly strengthened our case because they suggested the project had been planned long before the supposed emergency actions described in the demolition paperwork. Harold quietly gathered copies of community newsletters from neighbors who had saved them, while several contractors voluntarily provided invoices showing when equipment had actually been scheduled. None of them appeared to realize that their routine business records contradicted the official timeline submitted to the county. Piece by piece, the puzzle assembled itself without anyone raising their voice. By the end of the month, the binder that had started with a single questionable signature had grown into several organized volumes containing certified records, dated photographs, historical filings, survey comparisons, expert reports, travel documentation, and public meeting minutes. Rebecca placed the final tab into the last binder, closed it carefully, and looked across her conference table. They believed the demolition was the end of the story, she said. In reality, it was only the beginning of the evidence. For the first time since I had returned to an empty lot, I no longer felt like a homeowner trying to prove what he had lost. I felt like the person holding the complete blueprint of how the truth had been hidden in plain sight. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic interruptions, no raised voices, and no grand speeches. There was only the steady sound of pages turning as evidence replaced assumptions one document at a time. Deborah Whitmore arrived with several members of the Homeowners Association board, each carrying the same confidence I had seen at neighborhood meetings. They believed the paperwork protected them because it always had. Rebecca Lawson believed something different. She believed paperwork only mattered when it could survive careful examination. The hearing began with routine questions about property ownership, tax records, and the sequence of events. Every answer confirmed something I had already known for years. The land belonged to me. Every property tax had been paid. Every utility account remained active during my assignment in Montana. Then the evidence started appearing on the courtroom display. First came the travel records proving I was working nearly 2,000 miles away when the notices were supposedly acknowledged. Next came the historical preservation filing that required additional review before any lawful demolition could proceed. After that, the licensed document examiner explained the significant differences between my verified signatures and the signature attached to the county notice. Nobody interrupted because there was nothing to interrupt. Each exhibit connected naturally to the next, like pieces of a bridge finally locking into place. Rebecca then presented the historical survey maps beside the association's planning drawings. The dates drew immediate attention. Several concept plans identified my privately owned parcel as future community space before the demolition authorization had even been completed. The judge leaned forward and spent several quiet minutes comparing the timelines personally. Deborah attempted to explain that the drawings were only preliminary ideas, but the association's own. Newsletters described the future park in remarkable detail long before construction equipment arrived. Every newsletter, every invoice, every aerial photograph, and every county record reinforced the same conclusion. The project had been treated as inevitable before the legal process had actually been completed. One contractor testified that his company accepted the assignment, believing every required approval had already been secured. Another witness confirmed the equipment had arrived according to a schedule that did not match the official permit timeline. The courtroom remained calm, yet the direction of the case changed with every new document. Finally, the judge closed the last binder and looked directly at both legal teams. He stated that private property rights could not be displaced by assumptions, convenience, or incomplete administrative procedures. He noted that the evidence raised serious concerns regarding the reliability of the authorization process and that the sequence of approvals presented to the court did not support the actions taken against my property. Deborah's confidence disappeared without a single dramatic moment. It simply faded as the weight of the evidence became impossible to ignore. Months of careful preparation had accomplished what anger never could. The empty foundation, the brass house number resting in my pocket, the forgotten preservation record, the survey maps, and the overlooked dates had all returned exactly when they mattered most. For the first time since I stepped onto that vacant lot, I realized the truth no longer belonged only to me. It now belonged to the official record. 6 months after the hearing, I stood beneath the same old oak tree where this story had begun, but everything around it had changed. The empty lot was gone. In its place stood a beautifully rebuilt home that honored the original design, while incorporating modern engineering that would allow it to stand for generations. The wide front porch returned exactly where my father had built it decades earlier. The cedar swing was recreated from photographs my neighbors had shared. Even the stone mailbox still leaned slightly to the left because I asked the masons to preserve that small imperfection instead of correcting it. Some memories deserve accuracy more than perfection. The court's final judgment required far more than apologies. The Homeowners Association was ordered to compensate me for the extraordinary losses caused by the unlawful demolition, and the financial award reflected not only the value of the property, but also the extensive damages established during the litigation. The judgment also required the home to be rebuilt according to approved plans under proper legal supervision before the matter could be considered fully resolved. Insurance companies refused to absorb responsibility for actions determined to fall outside legitimate authority, leaving the association to face the consequences of decisions that should never have been made. The polished green sign announcing the future community park disappeared long before the construction crews finished rebuilding my home. No ceremony marked its removal. One morning, it was simply gone, leaving behind a patch of fresh grass where misplaced certainty had once been planted. Deborah Whitmore eventually resigned from her position, and a newly elected board introduced transparent procedures requiring independent legal review before any action involving private property could move forward. Several neighbors later admitted they had trusted official appearances without asking difficult questions. None of them could change what had happened, but many of them helped ensure the same mistakes would never happen again. Harold was the first guest I invited onto the rebuilt porch. We sat together as the evening sun filtered through the oak branches. Drinking iced tea from the same style of glass he had handed me on the day, he told me how everything had unfolded. He smiled when he noticed the brass house number 17 mounted beside the front door. I had carefully straightened it, but I left every scratch exactly where it had been because those marks had become part of the story. Inside the entryway, one framed photograph showed my parents standing in front of the original house many years earlier. Beside it rested the binder containing every certified document. That transformed an impossible situation into the truth recognized by the court. I rarely opened that binder anymore because I no longer needed proof to remind myself what had happened. The rebuilt home itself had become the evidence. Looking across the quiet neighborhood, I realized that justice had not arrived with dramatic speeches or angry confrontations. It arrived through patience, careful records, honest witnesses, and facts that refused to disappear no matter how many people overlooked them. The lesson I carried away was far greater than any financial judgment. A home can be measured in square feet, but its true value lives in the memories it protects. Those memories cannot be erased by paperwork, replaced by convenience, or buried beneath fresh landscaping. They endure, waiting for the truth to catch up with them. Every time I walk through my front door now, I glance at the old brass number 17 and remember the day I picked it up from the dust. It reminds me that real justice is never the loudest voice in the room. It is the quiet certainty that truth, when patiently protected, eventually finds its foundation again.